What's up, Internet? You're tuning in episode 161 of the FlipScreen Games Podcast, a weekly video game podcast where two best buds from different nations come together to discuss the wide world of video games. I'm your host, Peter Messi, joined as always by my very good friend and co-host, Mr. Steven Radford.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Steve.
How's it going? I'm good. We snap, jinx, whatever.
Is that what you guys say? You say snap?
Well, I think most people say jinx, but some people say snap. I say snap.
That's our thing, is jinx.
I've got a thing. Did you ever play the game where you like knocked on people's houses, doors, and run away?
Ding Dong Ditch? Sure.
You call it Ding Dong Ditch?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, I've not heard that one.
In Bristol, I love the alliteration.
Where I'm from, we called it Knock Knock Ginger. And I don't know why it was called Knock Knock Ginger.
Ginger?
Yeah.
It feels like the history of that is like some really like nasty thing about like ginger kids.
Probably, yeah.
You know, like it's probably mean. If I
probably get the ginger to go do it. Go on, knock knock ginger over there.
Have you ever had a kid do that to you? Have you ever been ding dong ditched?
No, I haven't.
The kids in my old neighborhood did it to our house a couple times, and it made me laugh so much. Like when I realized they were doing it, I literally went out and it was like, oh, like looked around like I was all like, what happened? Like I was just like, I bet they're cracking up.
Now I'd be going out like this in some like scary outfit or something, trying to get them, you know.
Just walk out with a machete and like a scream mask.
Exactly. Like I've got one of those Ring doorbells, so like alerts me when someone's at my front door. So before they'd even get there, I'd be like, "Oh, there's motion at the door. I'm gonna go out. I'm gonna get ready and scare the fuck out of these kids."
Love that. Well, we're not here to scare kids today. We're here to talk video games, and this is an episode I've really been looking forward to because earlier this week, or maybe it was late last week at this point, but Shawn Layden was, who, if you're not familiar, former CEO, head of PlayStation, right? You'll probably remember him from E3s from, 2014 to 2018, I think is right. And
I think his last appearance on stage was at the Game Awards with Reggie and with Phil Spencer.
Oh, right. Yeah, when they got all three of them on stage at the same time, which was obviously a pretty historic moment. So yeah, you know, Shawn Layden was he worked at PlayStation a really long time. He started working there in the 80s. He was the one of the leads at London studio for a while back in '99, and then of course he ended up becoming the VP of Sony Computer Entertainment Europe. He ended up going on to become the president of Sony Computer Entertainment Japan. And then, of course, in 2014, that was when he took over as president and CEO after Jack Tretton stepped down. And then in 2018, he ended up becoming the... He was focusing on Sony's worldwide studios, and you know the goal there was like him working to identify platform-defining content that helps drive the growth of Sony Interactive Entertainment. And then that was his last job at PlayStation until he stepped down in 2019. And then for the last couple of years, he's been an advisor to Tencent. So still in the games industry, even in his 60s, but obviously best known for
60s.
I believe so. Yeah. I think he's 61 or 2. And, you know, that was, you know, obviously the bulk of his career, right? What he's best known for is his time at PlayStation. And, you know, while Gamescom Asia was going on, he was on stage and gave an interview with Raw Fury's co-founder and chief publishing officer, Gordon Van Dyke. And they talked a bit about... AA studios specifically and AA games. And, you know, Shawn said a couple things that were making headlines this week. He said specifically that he feels like there's been a bit of a collapse of creativity. That's a direct quote in video games, and that he believes that, you know, the kind of choice to rely on blockbusters is, quote, a death sentence, were some of the real dramatic headlines that were pulled. But there was a lot in here that I thought was really, really interesting and insightful, given, you know, the kind of amount of time he's been in the video games industry, right? He's seen it go through a lot of changes, but, you know, just talking about like kind of where AAA and AA and indies and everything were at just a few years ago when he was at PlayStation compared to where they are today, I thought he had some really interesting and pretty illuminating thoughts. So I thought it would be a fun episode for you and I to kind of go through this interview and read some of his quotes and react to his opinions, because I think that some of them are things you and I have talked about on this show and stuff that we certainly agree with, and it seems like, you know, there is some data to argue that what he's saying makes sense. But yeah, I thought it was an interesting conversation. Did you get a chance to check it out?
Yeah, I did, and I was glad that there was a bit of pushback on the kind of honing in on double A, looking at indie and whether the indie games have kind of filled into that slot as well. I thought that was probably going to be, that would have been my point, right? That yes, double A's gone away, but indie's kind of taken up and plays more of a role in that space, and he addressed that too.
Yeah, and I thought what he had to say about indie games made sense to me too, because it was not at all him like you know, he made comments about how kind of the overall like increase in technology and everything has raised the floor on games so much that like back in the day bad games were just broken, and now like that's less and less a problem, and that like you have these really exciting creative games coming from the indie space, but that, you know, discoverability and promotion and those things can be a problem for those smaller titles, and that, you know, that was kind of some of the advantage of stuff like AA was that you had larger budgets and you know, more marketing and more room for experimentation and creativity, but with on a larger stage, right? Than many indie games are able to enjoy, right? Because there are so many good indie games that just get lost in the shuffle, you know. And we might talk about the few real big hits every year, but you know, you've seen a lot of studios you know, then struggle to replicate that success, struggle to take the success of one project and then, you know, translate it into a successful history or a future for the studio, I should say. And I think he touched on some pretty interesting points along some of those.
Yeah, I agree. And I also kind of felt like I was maybe reading between the lines a little as to whether he is involved with either Tencent or something else with AA and focusing in on that.
Yeah.
Like I know Tencent have put out some potentially AA games, like through the Timmy Studios, right, that they own.
Right. They've published
So
some stuff from smaller studios too, right? And they've engaged in a couple like partnerships. Like I remember when Don't Nod, right, the studio that created Life is Strange, when they went off and wanted to become fully independent, Tencent made like a minority investment to give them some cash to, you know, and like they're a great example of a studio that makes games that feel more AA than AAA, right? Or, you know, a little bit more AA than indie.
yeah, like Pokemon Unite, for example, is a great example. That's a 10-cent game. I don't think we'd say that's anywhere near an indie game. It's definitely not a AAA game. It kind of sits somewhere in the middle. It's a bit
happy middle
yeah,
ground.
it's a bit more risky than a AAA game, which, you know, usually focuses in on tried and trusted, you know, styles of games that we become used to. Kind of how you get in that Ubisoft rut of every game feels the same and there's nothing fresh, there's nothing new yet there.
Or the stuff that we've talked about just with like chasing trends, right? With like the way that like, well, Fortnite made $1 billion, so now we need our own, you know, and he talked about that specifically too, that I thought was really interesting. Like, you know, he was talking specifically about AA games, and we're gonna jump around here because there's a lot he said that we thought was interesting. But while talking about AA games, he said that they can bring, quote, the new thing and can be developed far quicker than AAA games. And he said that, you know, one of the things that is kind of really important, right, is like focusing on what that unique idea is and what the new thing is and not chasing trends, right? And he specifically said, if you're going to pitch me your AA game and in the first 2 pages of your deck is your monetization and revenue subscription scheme, I'm out. Your first page has to be, this game needs to be made and here's why. I want to see that fire. I don't want to see, here's the chief accountant on the team that's going to explain to you the game's monetization. And then he was specifically asked, you know, later on about what strategy to adopt for the AA studios that are still out there, right? Like, how can they succeed? How can they thrive?
Get bought by Microsoft would be my suggestion.
Unfortunately,
you know,
yeah,
a lot of them have been snapped up. I think of the Double Fines and the Obsidians, they've been purchased.
Right, right. And you know, he's again, right, that's like the few that are still out there, that are still independent, right? And you know, how do you find your niche between, you know, focusing on benchmarks and graphical fidelity and more content and bigger, right? AAA, and then the kind of more risky, you know, innovative, very artistically focused world of indies, right? Like, how do you kind of toe that line so that you have, again, like those bigger budgets, those higher production values, more marketing weight, but not having to fit in this increasingly narrow and expensive AAA box. And he said that AA has a natural niche, which is to bring, quote, the new thing, as opposed to, for example, quote, a dollar store version of God of War. And I really liked that quote, because I think that that's been something that I really have been so frustrated about over the last couple years, right? Like, as we've seen more risk aversion and you know, more of these companies like tightening their belt coming off of a real economic boom period for the industry during lockdown, is that like so many of what a new studio is working on feels like our version of this, right? Like, Me Too. We also have a Fortnite. We also have an open world behind the back, you know, adventure game. We also have a shooter. You know, and it's like, you know, you think about, you brought up Ubisoft earlier, right? And they're constantly critiqued for their games being similar. And you think about how innovative.
Well, and also chasing trends, you know, like,
sure.
Oh, NFTs, we've got a solution for that. Oh, you want a live service game? We've got a solution for that.
We have 10 of them.
It's always exactly like, oh, we're building an Assassin's Creed game, but it's going to be live service. And it's just like, come on, like, we don't care. Like, oh, and we're turning Assassin's Creed into like an RPG, and some people liked it and some people didn't. It's just like, yeah, it's like, why is everything always going to be the same as something else that someone else is doing?
Right. Yeah. And again, right, like, you think about, you know, at the beginning of the Xbox 360 generation, when they came out with Assassin's Creed and then like the Ezio trilogy, like, those games were groundbreaking, you know, like they were pushing that genre forward. They were, you know, changing the way people thought about games. And then now it's like, how many versions of that do we need? How many iterations on those same ideas do we need before it's like, you know, it's time to focus on the new thing? And that's the problem, right? You know, he's talking about why he thinks this is an issue. And he said, today, the entry cost for making a AAA game is in the triple-digit millions now. I think naturally risk tolerance drops, and you're looking at sequels, you're looking at copycats, because the finance guys who draw the line say, well, if Fortnite made this amount of money in this amount of time, my Fortnite knockoff can make this in that amount of time. We're seeing a collapse of creativity in games today with studio consolidation and the high cost of production. And this is exactly what we've been talking about.
To some extent, that's what AAA has always meant, right? I think people think it means big top budget, and maybe it's become that. But it used to mean these are the least risky titles. So if I'm pitching a project, this is a AAA game because it's, you know, it's something we've done before. It's another platformer. We know this is going to work. It's a great character, yada, yada, yada. This is a kind of our bread and butter, and we constantly make this. Whereas AA was, it's maybe a little bit different. We might be taking a risk on this one. It's not something that's been done before. I think it then became AAA is super expensive. AA is a little bit cheaper, and indies where all the cool stuff happens. But AA used to have that creativity, and Shawn definitely said that, right?
Yeah, and I think like that's one of the things he points out, right? He, like, as he's making this point, right? Like he said that, like, you know, in, you know, generations past, right? Like, in a different time in the industry, you know, the focus was always on just like, is this game fun? Like, are people going to like this game? Because that's what's going to lead to it selling, right? And it wasn't about what's the monetization model for this game? How's this game going to be making money 2 or 3 years from now? Does it have sequel potential? Is it this? Is it that? And not that, like, thinking about those things is, like, you know, inherently a bad thing, right? Like, there is obviously a business side to making video games. And you've seen how companies like, you know, Nintendo, for example, right? Like, their whole bread and butter is managing their IP really well, right? Like, that's why they make money, is that they have really strong IP and they've maintained it.
I would say they've done a good job at having some AA and some AAA in there as well. They're definitely
Exactly.
not afraid to experiment, and we spoke about that over on
But
Nintendo Noise this week.
and I think that has to, yeah, we did. That's a really good episode. If you want to go check that out, we talked all about the leaks around their new MMO. Really interesting conversation between us and Sierra. If you want to go check that one out. And yeah, he admitted that like risk tolerance was fairly high in those days, right? When there were less monetization models and there were less like, there was less money in games. I think there was, and I think that that bears out, right? You think about like the PlayStation 3 era, for example, there are a lot of, quote unquote AAA games that Sony produced that are weird and are not like super traditional. And during that generation, right, when PlayStation was getting their lunch eaten by Xbox, that was their strategy for differentiating themselves, was having weird, interesting, creative, exclusive games that you could only play on PlayStation. And that ended up, helping them bridge that gap, right? And they ended up catching up and becoming neck and neck after getting trounced for most of the generation. And it was that interest in experimentation that I think led to a lot of their big successes, right? Like, and things that I think now maybe seem passe even, but like The Last of Us was a creative risk. That was a studio. It was a studio that was best known at that point for Uncharted, right? And like,
I mean, even Uncharted had to be a risk, right?
Sure.
Oh, you did Jack and Daxter for the last 20 years, and prior to that, you did Crash Bandicoot, and
Totally.
now you want to do something completely different. That's this realistic.
Even
character.
that though, there's I think more of a through line between like this is a fun platformer, fun action platformer, fun shooter platformer, and then we're doing that, but now it's a human character instead of a cartoon character. Okay. Right? Where it's like The Last of Us is very different, right? It's like it's more stealth oriented. It's it's dour, it's sad, it's heavy.
It's a very mature game as well, which I think was unexpected from Sony at the time.
And from Naughty Dog. And I think that that is something that now it's like so closely associated with them, right? It's like they're probably their most famous IP. And that would have been a risk then, and he talks about that this is actually from an older interview that I found. So,
see, would we say The Last of Us is AA then?
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
But I think that's his point, though, is that right? He's saying that in the past, studios focused on whether the game was fun rather than monetization, and risk tolerance was fairly high. And then he's talking about like how the cost of AAA games has gone up so much. And there was an interview from 2020 that I found. This was him speaking at Game Lab Live, and he was talking about the AAA business model, and he said that it was not sustainable. He said it was, quote, just not sustainable. And he said that, I'm going to pull from this article a little bit. This is from gamesindustry.biz. I'll link to it down below. Layden recalled the days of $1 million production budgets for the biggest games on the market and referred to a commonly stated theory that the cost of development has doubled with every new generation of consoles. Quote, the problem is that the model is just not sustainable, explaining that the current generation has seen the cost of development reach between $80 million and $150 million for most AAA games, excluding marketing costs, with production taking up to 5 years from start to finish, which is now even longer. Right, like that was.
Isn't it like $250,000 to half a billion now, like 250?
Depending on the game, right? There are plenty of games.
Yeah,
that, like Destiny, I think costs $500 million to develop or something like that, right?
And that's what we saw from some of the Sony leaks, right? Some of the Insomniac leaks,
right?
That
those games were like 200 million, right? It was like that was like the cost of Spider-Man and Horizon was like roughly $200 million. So it's 50 million more than it was 4 years ago, and development cycles are longer. I remember you and I have referenced. There's that tweet. That was making the rounds from Jason Schreier like a year or two ago, where he's like, if a game started development now, it would be a PlayStation 6 game, right? And that was like 2 or 3 years ago, because game just takes so long to make. Starfield took 10 years, right? Like,
the amount of like you have to put your life into something that could be a huge risk, like Starfield, and then it kind of stumble out the gate. Man, it must be heartbreaking. And that you got to think about that when we spoke about it a couple of weeks ago, and we had those reviews come in, and it's like not quite living up to expectations. You can see why developers hit back.
Totally. So pulling more from this is from that same conversation at Game Lab. There's a little more context I thought was worth bringing up. He said, I don't think that in the next generation you can take those numbers and multiply them by 2 and think that you can grow. I think the industry as a whole needs to sit back and go, all right, what are we building? What's the audience expectation? What is the best way to get our story across and say what we need to say? It's hard for every adventure game to shoot for that 50 to 60 hour gameplay milestone because that's going to be so much more expensive to achieve. And in the end, you may close some interesting creators and their stories out of the market if that's the kind of threshold they have to meet. We have to reevaluate that. So how can we look at it and say, is there another answer? Instead of spending 5 years making an 80-hour game, what does 3 years and a 15-hour experience look like? What would be the cost around that? Is that a full-throated experience? Personally, as an older gamer, I would welcome a return to the 12 to 15-hour AAA game. I would finish more games, first of all, and just like a well-edited piece of literature or a movie, looking at the discipline around that could give us something that's tighter and more compelling content. It's something I'd like to see a return to in this business. And the reason I wanted to bring... Hold on. Let me just finish this point, because I've been trying to drive to this and we keep getting sidetracked, which is fine, because this is a great conversation. But the reason I bring this up, you brought up The Last of Us, and you said, would you consider that AA? Absolutely not. The reason that I bring this up is that if you look at this article, right, in this interview, the context of this is 2020 when The Last of Us Part 2 had just come out. And in the context of this question is The Last of Us, right? It says, he was talking about how he was really proud of The Last of Us. That was something that was like started under his tenure, and it's really great to see how good it is. And here's what he said. Or this is pulling from the article. However, while The Last of Us Part 2 might represent a new level of artistic achievement for a specific type of game, it also represents another trend in the games industry. Most players could finish The Last of Us in around 15 hours, but The Last of Us Part 2 takes 25 hours to complete. Naughty Dog spent 3.5 years making The Last of Us, while the sequel needed 6. Sony isn't likely to disclose the production budget for either game. We know how much it costs now, but the smart money is on a substantial increase there too. So that is the thing I wanted to bring up, right? Is you brought that up. No, it was a AAA game, but because games took less time to make and cost less than half as much to make as they do now, you could take risks like that. You could make a game like that because it wasn't going to be, okay, we're dedicating the studio who we depend on to deliver multi-million-dollar, multi-billion-dollar hits on a certain basis, right? You can't have a game take 10 years and then underperform, like we talked about with Starfield. We got a comment about that recently where someone was like, you guys always talk about Starfield underperforming. It was one of the top best-selling games of that year. Like, how did it underperform? I mean, ask Xbox. It underperformed their expectations. Their expectations may have been unrealistic, but when you spend 10 years of development on the game and $500 million or $200 million, somewhere in between that, right?
Or like $47 billion or however much they paid for Bethesda.
Right. Forget that part of it. Forget that part of it. Just the development cost.
Yeah.
You need a way bigger return. So a risk, any risk, right? A risk of, oh, let's make this fun little 15. It's a risk. It's a big risk because if it takes... you don't have that same threshold. And again, if you need to make a game cross the certain threshold of 25 hours, whatever, and it's going to take 6 years, 6 years is a lot of time to wrap up, the Neil Druckmanns of the world that you depend on to deliver your next blockbuster in the Last of Us series that's going to be a TV show, that's going to have merch, that's going to do this, that's that. It's like, why would we have Naughty Dog make a new IP and spend 10 years developing it, and then maybe it's not going to be as popular as Uncharted or The Last of Us, or in half that time, we have them make a sequel, right?
I kind of think you let them do something fresh in the same way that risk pulled off for Guerrilla. They were the Killzone studio, and we saw this week that they've said they're done with that franchise. They're not the Killzone studio anymore. They're now the Horizon studio, and I feel like that was a risk that was a risk,
but it was easy to do when Killzone was not that successful. Whereas, like, if you made The Last of Us Part, I think it's inarguable, right? Definitely, like 1,000%, I would put money on this. I'd bet my life on it that it will take less time, less money to make a Last of Us Part 3, and that game will make more money than any new IP that Naughty Dog puts out for their first game, even if it's successful, because we know that that's how video games work. The first one comes out, some people play it, it gets some buzz, that's great. The second one always does better, right? Unless it's
what about
bad.
Uncharted 5? You know,
exactly, right?
Yeah.
People would lose it if they made an Uncharted 5. That could be the return of Nathan Drake. It could be with new characters, whatever. Uncharted is an IP that has weight, right? And there's a reason that we get fucking 10 new Mario games on every Nintendo console, and we got 1 new IP. 2 if you want to get, 3 or 4 if you want to include indie games or whatever. But, like, are any of those getting a sequel? Are they a new IP? No, they're not. Right? ARMS was there. This is our new game, and it flopped. And we're not going to get another one. And maybe we'll get another new IP on the next Switch, but, like, again, it's like...
We might get an ARMS. It might be an arms and legs. Yeah, it's like...
from your lips to Shigeru Miyamoto's ears. But that's the point, right? Is that, like... You used to be able to get away with that. And I think you brought up how Nintendo has done a good job of continuing to put out those cheaper to develop games and everything, right? And I think that is a big reason why they can make those games, is that they can depend on the big bankable hits. And frankly, they have the ability to leverage their well-established, well-maintained IP to overcharge for games, right? There are how many of these like AA experiences that like are probably not worth the same amount of money as something like Breath of the Wild, but cost the same amount.
They do charge less for them now, though. And then they're even doing that in the States. Like, I know they've always done it in Europe, but, look at Mario Party. It's a cheaper title. Yep. It's not as costing as much as, say, Tears of the Kingdom did, the $70 game. They know what they can charge. This section from 2020 makes me sad that Shawn decided he needed to step down from PlayStation, and because I really feel that
I really liked him.
Me too.
I thought he was a really good leader for the organization. I think he understands what consumers really want.
Exactly. 12 to 15 hour AAA game. I'd finish more of them. Other people would. The fact that it's like a well-edited movie. 100%.
The Last of Us is one of the best games of all time. That's what everyone loves to talk about, and it is not 20 hours. And I think that contributes to that.
Part 2 is it's too long. There's like a section
and
in
again,
there,
we both love
3.
that game. That game is incredible, and I think there are a lot of things it does so much better than the first game. And I know that that's a somewhat controversial opinion, right? But I think most people would agree the first game is better, and I think that the pacing is part of it.
Yeah, but
you could cut fucking 10 hours from that game. You could easily cut 5 hours from that game, and it would be better.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. But it's just like, rather than that model, that like, oh, here's how we can sustain our business and we can make these smaller budget titles, which they did do, and I presume Shawn was responsible for commissioning, Lost Legacy, which kind of started this trend of let's make the smaller games and we can put them out. And we don't do the DLC anymore. We do the smaller game. We do Miles Morales in between the Spider-Man and the Spider-Man 2. That would have been done under his tenure, I would imagine. Then instead, we got Jim Ryan, who was, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do live service, and that's going to be the way we sustain our business. But it was such a huge pivot from what PlayStation was set up to do with their narrative-driven games into something completely different, and that they had to
to waste billions of dollars.
Yeah,
literally billions of dollars.
Billions. And then it got to a point when their CFO even said, "We've got to figure out a way to make this more sustainable, and that includes going on other platforms, which is why they're on PC." I think if they'd have managed to make this sustainable, they probably wouldn't have needed to do that.
So this is the thing I didn't know until I was doing this digging. So Shawn Layden has officially said that the reason he stepped down was because he was like tired and he needed to retire. Word on the street is that a big part of the reason he left was because he disagreed with. I'm thinking what you literally just said his name.
Jim Ryan.
Jim Ryan. Thank you. Like my brain was just Jack Tretton. It's like nope, that's not. That's older. That they didn't agree on the direction of like what the focus should be. And, that was his focus from 2019 was that he was going to be focusing on software. And I wonder if that was part of the disagreement was like Shawn and the bean counters wanting to make their Fortnite knockoff and not the next innovative thing, which seems to be Layden's philosophy, right? Is that like the only way you're going to have success is by trying to figure out the next thing, not copying the current thing. And we've talked ad nauseum about how that I think that mentality is poisonous in this industry right now, that like it's everywhere, and that everyone for the last several years has been like, how do I, Suicide Squad killed the Justice League, right? Like Concord, like all these games that have come out and immediately just fucking flopped. All of them are taking studios that didn't make those kinds of, well, Concord is a bit of a different story. Rocksteady, right? Famous for making a trilogy of exceptional, groundbreaking, single-player games, story-driven games, and it's like, how do we have them make a Fortnite? Because it'll make more money. And it's like, that can't be the thing, right? Like, I think Shawn is totally right. It has to be, the game needs to be good. The product needs to be good, right? And you see this same, like, bullshit business school brain rot across industries, right? Where it's like, oh, like, what movies need right now is IP, right? Like, that's what we need. It's safe adaptations of IP, ignoring the fact, right? Like, think about how many toys just got licensed to become movies in reaction to Barbie, because the takeaway was movies about toys sell, and not a good movie that people liked made money, right? Like, that's never the takeaway. Is not, maybe it's making something that's creative and different, right? And that we had a big blockbuster movie for the first time in years that was not a superhero movie, right? And the same thing with Dune, right? And like, two extremely different movies that made a shitload of money. I wonder why.
Well, I mean, Oppenheimer was out the same time as Barbie, and that did pretty well as well.
And that's a bit of a different thing too, because that's like a bit of a Christopher Nolan thing. Like, he's one of those directors that has that level of like prestige, in the same way that like somebody like
James Cameron.
Well, I was gonna say in our industry, right? Like, that's how you get Death Stranding. It's like, oh, well, he's an auteur. Yeah. He can make whatever he wants because we're going to put a Hideo Kojima game on it and people will come and see it. That's great. That's another way that you can get interesting ideas across. But that can't be the only way, right? How do you get the next, Shigeru Miyamoto, the next,
the next Kojima?
Yeah,
where is he?
Or, Tim from Double Fine, or like any of those kinds of people, the auteurs, is like, it's by making new stuff. It's not by like, how do we make Fortnite but better? Or in reality, like not better, different and worse.
We have got some of those people from the indie world, weirdly. I think like the Toby Foxes of the world.
Sure, absolutely.
It's like, but I think anything that he puts out, I'm going to pick up and play.
Absolutely. And I think that is a great transition to this other quote from Shawn that I thought was interesting, where he said, this is him talking about AA like being gone and how that's kind of a threat to the ecosystem. And this is where there was that pushback you were talking about, right? Where this is pulling from the article, noting the general standard of games, including indie titles, is much higher thanks to advancement in tools. I mentioned this earlier. He continued, now if we can just get a bit more interest and excitement and exposure for these lower budget, but super creative and super unusual types of games, I'd like to see more of that. Because if we're just going to rely on blockbusters to get us through, I think that's a death sentence. And I think that's a good point because, I know anecdotally, right, like you and I and Max, like, we play indie games. We play a lot of indie games a year. Games journalists and commentators and people that are deeply entrenched in video games, right? Like, they play indie games. The average person doesn't play video game or indie games, right? Like, I have friends that are fucking hardcore gamers that play a lot of video games every week that do not play indie games ever. Do not touch them. Never.
That's a real shame. But is that not the same as the movie industry?
He literally brings that up about how you've got this point now where it's like the two kinds of movies that get made are like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and
or
like
someone from A21.
Yeah, like Sundance movies, right? And that like in the olden days, right? Like back in the day, you had that middle ground. He literally said in the center, that middle piece, there used to be Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep in Vermont. You can make that movie. People went to the theaters to see it. But those movies and that kind of content found a place to go. It went to Netflix, Amazon, Apple Plus, all the different streaming services. It had a place to go. And
that is what Phil Spencer's vision was, right, for Game Pass initially, I think.
Yeah, and we've seen how that's borne out, though.
It has borne out, but I don't think that's him. I think that's
it's bean counters. It's bean counters drawing the line that we need to make more money on this, and it's like you need to have the Field of Dreams mentality. If you build it, they will come. Not how do we copy what's going on across the fence? Because it's like that so rarely works out, right? Not never. Fortnite. Great example of how to fucking take someone and be like, oh, you're the Pepsi to their Coke, and be like, nah, bitch, we're Coke. Fair enough. But like, do you know why that happened? Because Epic had the insane fucking amount of money that they make from running Unreal Engine to invest basically the same amount of money that it took to develop it to pivot it to another game. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to put out Concord and have it not connect and be like, let's spend another 5 years working on it. Because of course they don't. They already spent an absurd amount of money developing it in the first place. That's the whole fucking problem with these long-ass development cycles, these insane budgets, and like the teams working on the games not necessarily having belief in the core idea the way they would about, you know, the games they're known for making, right? Like, I think it's inarguable that if Rocksteady had just made another single-player open-world game, or even not open-world, they'd gone back to the Metroidvania thing, it probably would have been successful. And yeah, it might not have made as much money as something like Kill the Justice League could if it had worked. It didn't, so it made no money, basically. It lost money, right? And B, like, you missed out on, like, planting a seed, right? Like, if they, like, there was rumors for years they were making a Superman game. If they had made a Superman game and it had done well and it had connected, it probably would have sold extremely well, and then a sequel would have been made for less money, and that would have made more, you know, and it's like, and on and on and on. And yeah, I mean, I think you look at, like, we talked about that with, like, Spider-Man 2. It's like, they didn't need to spend that much money on that game. Right? They built the core systems and everything in the first game. The map is barely different. You know, it's like, granted, totally different. What's there is different. But it's like, there are so many assets they were able to build on. Why did it cost $200 million? That to me seems like mismanagement. And like, I've never managed a video game studio. Maybe that's the cost of doing business these days.
Well, that, and I would imagine they also set it up for, they probably put some groundwork in for, we're going to get this ready for the PC release. From the get-go,
and there was supposed to be that online component, which they probably sunk a lot of money into developing, and then now that's not coming out. Oh, surprise, surprise.
Yeah, which is, you know, it's not really. But I mean, I think that there is a place for these AA games, and I do, and I think indie games have shown that. Like, you know, Lucky Squire made it on day one onto PS Plus. And we've seen a bunch of games come to Game Pass on day one, and people do get excited for them, and people do play them, and people do find them, and it is a way to discover them. And I think Phil Spencer maybe wanted Game Pass to be Netflix, where it's like, right, we have a little taste of everything, and people can find different stuff, and there's some cheaper stuff here that's quick and easy for us to bash out and make, or maybe we license it and we pay Devolver some money and we get it on our platform. Whereas I think Microsoft from above, Phil Spencer, wants it to be Disney Plus, where they own everything and it's theirs, and they have it on the platform, and everything maybe costs a little bit more, but at the end of the day, it's theirs, and they just can put the price up and charge whatever the fuck they want for Call of Duty, and they know people will pay for it.
And I think it's really frustrating, because I think it really, again, it reeks of NBA business brain, right? This idea that like the game now is to leverage IP, is to acquire IP and own this big library and force people to pay for access to it and yada, yada, yada. And like, don't get me wrong. Streaming is a viable model, obviously, right? Like when Netflix brought it out, it changed the game, and it really influenced the way that television was made and produced. And it's been pretty bad for the television industry. And you can go and look at how much some of these streaming services actually make, that like most of them are losing money. Right? Even in,
apart from Netflix, everyone is losing money.
And even ones that you might think are successful, right? Like, don't do as well as you think. And I think that that's because like we've trained people that like content shouldn't cost anything, and that you should just be able to pay for access. And it's that problem then becomes, right, of like with Game Pass, for example, to take it back to that, the mentality there is like, well, we'll release this big exciting thing, and then that'll bring in new users. But the reality is that it doesn't work that way, right? It's that like there isn't actually any more money being made because Starfield is out if you need everybody to have their subscription on at all times for it to be a profitable model, right? Because there's no actual added value for you as the rights holder to add new exciting content that costs $500 million to develop when no one's going to pay for it. Right? It's like, no, like what you're actually charging them for is to access to your old shit. And that's great, But because now we all have this mentality of like, that's the future of art, like that's where it's going, it's that access model, everything is being built around that. And the reality is that it's like, it's not super sustainable. It's a like, the success of Netflix comes from it being the de facto choice, right? Like, the reason Netflix is as popular as it is because for a very large percentage of people, watching TV means Netflix, period. And it's not streaming, it's Netflix. That's what the value is. And, you know, I think that
a large part of people playing games probably is Fortnite.
Sure, and I mean, it is, right? But like, the point is that you never get the Fortnite if you don't take risks and you don't experiment. And I think that you could very easily, to Shawn's point, reach a point where people are like, video games suck now. They're boring. They're all the same thing. It's all the same shit. There's no innovation
I was
anymore.
feeling like that with movies. You know, it was like everything was in everything coming out of Disney was like Star Wars or MCU, and it was just
or
like,
a remake of an animated movie from 40 years ago
with like live action. It's like, is there anything new? Have you got anything fresh for me anymore?
No, not really, right? And it's like, even like Pixar, which used to be, that was the new stuff. It's like now they're doing sequels because they're safer. And they just made their most successful movie ever that was a sequel. And I bet you that that's going to mean that a lot less original scripts get produced. But then again, right, it's like, what you're not thinking about is that, like, the value of creating an IP, right? It's like, yeah, maintaining an IP is great. Growing an IP is great. Making a new IP that's going to connect and have sequels and spinoffs and merch and whatever, like, that's how you make the next thing. Like, that's how you get the next big hit. And yeah, I mean, look at movies now, even TV, right? Like, there's all this conversation now about how they're doing a reboot of The Office. You can't even make a fucking original sitcom anymore, right? It needs to have IP recognition. It's like that. Yeah. Like, I think Shawn really hit it on the head with the whole, like, a collapse of creativity, because there's just not space for it. You know, there's not space to take risks. And, you know, I think that was something that I thought was interesting, right? Is like, he also talks a little bit about how he thinks part of the future, right, is really looking at emerging markets and like places where this paradigm isn't already in place, right? That's going to be where we get the new ideas. And it's sad to think about. Not that I'm upset that, like, new markets and new like, that's always a good thing. But, like, I don't want to see, you know, places like America or Japan or the UK or like these places that have a history of game development fall into a rut because they're all risk averse. And you're at this point where it's like, we either need to be so small and so lean that every single game we make is make or break, and we're going to die if we don't have our next success break through and be a massive hit. Or,
I mean, that was always AA, though. That was always AA. They were always on the brink. You know?
Yeah, but like, you think about stuff like companies like THQ and stuff like that before they went out of business, like, they were very financially solvent because they made types of games that were cheap to produce and they made a lot of money. And that market existed. And, you know, a lot of those games were bad, but like that was an option. You know, there was that middle ground for other types of games. And yeah, it's like you see that now, where it's kind of like the two paths of success are either massive record-setting blockbuster or indie darling that came out of nowhere. And it's kind of like, you know, I mean, look out, like, I think I can think of a lot of studios that had that moment that have now struggled, right? And had to get acquired or go away, right? And like you brought up, we talked about Double Fine. It's like, I can't think of an indie studio with a more bankable track record. Their entire history has been struggling to stay afloat until they got acquired by a massive multi-billion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar corporation.
It was the same deal with Obsidian, right? You know, that came out of Black Earl Studios. It was once they went bust, they started their own thing. They do a bunch of like for hire work. They work on Fallout New Vegas, which is beloved. They famously miss out on that bonus. They then have to like do Kickstarters to launch their own games and continue to do that while also working on like South Park Stick of Truth. And then eventually they're just like, you know what, we can't do this anymore. And they partner with Microsoft, and they still push out really creative games. Like, you know, I can't wait for the next Outer Worlds. I really can. I think it's going to be great. And the same deal with what was the game they did last year or the year before that was just like so unique, right? And it was like that was never going to happen. We would never got anything like it. Whereas just like I'm reading a book and I'm making choices. What was the name of that game?
Oh my god. It's right on the tip of my tongue. Oh, Pentiment.
Yeah, Pentiment. It's like we would have never got anything like Pentiment because no one would have paid for it. No one would have like been like, yeah, that sounds like a really cool idea. Let's publish it. Let's greenlight that. Let's go for it. That only could have happened.
It's like, when you guys rather just making it like, can you get another Pillar of Eternity? Can you give us one? It's one of those.
Something in that universe or
yeah. And I think it used to be easier, and this was true in film too, right? I'm sorry we're like making so many examples from other industries, but they're older, so it's easier to pull from them for examples. But like there was this like kind of conventional wisdom in Hollywood, right? That's like you do one for them and one for you, one for the studio, one for me, one for the studio, one for me, and like the number of people that can do that are shockingly small now. But yeah, I mean, I think like that's a great example of like, I think it used to be easier to be like, well, we just finished the Uncharted trilogy. Can we take a risk on this Last of Us thing? Yeah, why not? Right? Your last three were all a big hit. Like, even if this one's a flop, okay, let's see what it is. Let's see what it does. And I do think there's just a lot less room for that. Even if you are somebody that's like, you think you're safe because you got bought up by Xbox or whatever. It's like, I mean, look what happened to Arcane, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, do you not think that maybe, some indie games kind of are AA now? Like, I look at anything that Devolver puts out and I'm just like, those really, to me, often aren't indie games. They're coming from bigger studios. I look at the game, like the Dead Cell studio. They've blossomed into a AA.
Yeah.
Baldur's Gate 3. Is that really indie? Don't know that it was. I kind of feel like that's a AA game at this point.
Sure, but you think about that, right? Like even that game that had the success of the biggest, tabletop RPG game of all time as an IP, and they had financial backing from Wizards of the Coast. So
they did, yeah.
But yeah, so to your point, it's not like there's none of those games, but there used to be a lot of them, right? There used to be publishers that was all that they did. He literally brought up, he said, in the gaming business, you have Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, indie stuff, but then that middle piece, that middle layer that used to be where Interplay, Gremlin, Ocean, THQ, all those companies made their money, that middle piece is gone. If you can become AAA, you survive. Or if you do something interesting in the indie space, you could. But AA is gone. And I think that's a threat to the ecosystem, if you will. If I'm looking at indie stuff, with the advent of technologies like the latest Unreal Engine or what Unity can give you, I think we can all say the standard quality of video games is pretty high compared to 10 years ago. And I think that that's kind of part of the problem too, right? Is that like, I agree with you in terms of like indie being like kind of this last bastion of like, this is where the really creative stuff from, this and that and this and that. But I mean, man, like you and I both know how close a lot of the most popular indie games came to never existing because the model is really unsustainable, right? Like go read Jason Schreier's book, Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, right? Like the team at Shovel Knight, they all quit their jobs and mortgaged their homes. If that game hadn't been what it is, they would all have lost their entire livelihood.
Yeah, I mean,
and their homes.
Same with Cuphead.
Same with Cuphead,
exactly
right?
Yeah.
Or maybe I was thinking of Cuphead and that wasn't, but they emptied out their savings. I remember they all worked at another studio and then they all left together and whatever. Massive risk.
Sounds like the Annapurna Interactive team lately,
right? Great example. And then Stardew Valley, right? Which is like that's one of the most successful indie games probably the most successful indie game of the next several years. And how did that happen? It's because the guy that created it had a girlfriend who was willing to fucking subsidize him making a video game for like 6 years. Like it's like that can't be the only way. That can't be it. Like if that's the way, right, that we're gonna get the big ideas from indie, I have bad news for you, Steve and dear listeners. It's way harder to do that now. It was way easier to get loans 10 years ago. Inflation isn't what it is 10 years ago. Like it was way easier to take that huge risk 10 years ago in this industry. And not only that was a new time where it was like we're doing something new and groundbreaking. Now you could make a really sick pixel platformer and it's like, yeah, they're a dime a dozen though. It's like, how many of them come out that you don't even fucking hear about? You know?
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. But then you do get the diamond in the rough, the Balatros here and
Yeah,
there.
absolutely. But again, it's like, is that it? That's going to be the only way that we have like new ideas in this industry? That's really bad. That's really dangerous. And I think that like what you just said about being like, I'm bored with movies. It's like, well, how long until that happens here? You know? And
that is a worry, and that's been, I think that should be a worry for everyone in the industry, or fatigue that we spoke about literally on Nintendo Noise again this week of like live service games, and everyone's got sick and tired of them, and it's just like, I can't do any more
or
of
they
these.
Can't afford them, or they've aged out of having enough time to play them, right? Whatever.
Which is a big thing for both of us, right? It's just like, where do you find time to play an MMO for the rest of your life? I used to be big into Destiny, and it just gets to a point where you just can't do it anymore. It's like
it's choosing to do that at the expense of playing literally anything else.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and it's like, well, I'm not going to do that, and like, again, there are people that want to, but it's like, how many of them are there? How many people want to do that? And can they sustain 10 of these games that need to make hundreds of millions? I don't know. Probably not. And so I started bringing up the other markets thing a few paragraphs ago in this conversation. And there was something he said there that I thought was really interesting. So he said that, there's a real importance of emerging markets, not just for new players, but also for like new developers. So he said, I look at Asia, South Asia, this part of the world as where all the next great opportunities are going to come from. And the level of the game...
He is a bit biased in this conversation. Let's just remember he is an advisor for Tencent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will say, perhaps that is the reason he feels that way, though, right? Because he's actually working there and seeing those games. And to your point, perhaps there's an interest in some kind of AA project at Tencent that he's invested in, so he's actually like going and meeting developers and playing their games and getting a sense for like what the scene is there, what the development scene is. So he said the level of game development talent here grows faster than the rest of the world, which I mean I think makes sense when you think about how there's a bunch of those like somewhere like China, right, where it's like there've been really strict limitations on video games for a long time, and then that's been lifted over the last couple of years, probably by a huge number of people that are playing video games and influenced to think about creating them for like a whole new generation, right? Like that are 5, 6, whatever years in to video games being more available and more prevalent in the country. So it's like that makes a lot of sense to me. The idea that like the talent is growing there faster because they've got catching up to do.
I feel like that we've even seen that in Japan, right? Like I feel like there's been a bunch of indie titles coming out there. Like look at Power World this year, right? It was a small indie studio. You could probably argue that that's maybe even AA at this point. We had Dave the Diver last year from a Korean studio, not indie, even though it was up for Indie Game of the Year. It was definitely a AA game.
So then he went on to say, I think here in Asia, we have a lot of small, scrappy studios with good talent. They just need to break through. It's just a bit of luck to find the right IP or to find the right platform. I'd also like to see more games being made in that country, in that culture. It's like, quote, if my game doesn't sell a lot in California, I'm not successful. Well, California's not your market. Look at the markets here. They're growing. The economies are robust. There's more disposable income, and you can make a great game in Indonesia for that market. And I think that's interesting, right? That like, for so long, like video games have been, pretty localized, right? It's like it's America, mostly in the West, scattered places in Europe and Japan, right? Are like the big hotbeds of development activity. And the idea that there aren't, tons and tons of people in South America or South Asia or, India or like, any like wherever, South Africa, right? That like have ideas for games that would connect with a worldwide audience, or that at the very least could be successful at home, right? And that like this idea of like bigger, more is like, it's a really toxically capitalistic way to think about making art, right? And that like there are so many studios that have shown that making a smaller game on a smaller budget for a smaller audience that costs less is a totally proven successful business model. But so many of the big publishers, like, as you have this consolidation, they're bigger and bigger and bigger, and they need to make more and more money to be successful and to stay afloat and to not get gobbled up by some other bigger fish. And like, that's the problem. Like, you know, we've talked about how it's like, you know, like before Xbox acquired Activision Blizzard and Bethesda, it's like, you know, there were a lot more big publishers, right? These are the big AAA publishers. And it's like, well, 3 of them became 1, right? Like, that's bad. That's a lot less games in town. That's a lot less opportunities for you to find somebody with some money to throw around for your new cool idea that needs incubation, that needs marketing.
Yeah, I mean, even then, like, I feel like the only big publisher I can think of that was really still doing it was EA, right? You know, with like It Takes Two and their EA Originals series. That was really the only way these games, these double A games, were happening in these big publishers at that point.
Yeah, and like, you know, scattered other examples. There's like the Ubi Originals, which gave us like
yeah, and I guess we got Private Division as well.
Sure, right? Like, that's a great one. And like ID at Xbox and stuff like that, right? Like, it's like they exist, but it's like, I mean, a lot of them, they didn't make a shitload of money, even if they were profitable. And it's like, well, you know, we only have so many resources to go around. Do we want to make 3 small games that make a modest profit, or do we want to make 1 big game that makes a big profit? It's not that simple, but I think if you're somebody that doesn't make art and all you do is look at spreadsheets and try to decide how to make the company the most profitable in the short term, right? Not long-term health of the business, not long-term investment in IP, not what is this going to mean for PlayStation 30 years from now. It's what does this mean in the next 6 months when it's time for me to report to the stockholders and, you know, inevitably jump to some other business where I try to do the same job for more money. You know, it's like the fiduciary responsibility there is short-term returns for investors, not the long-term health of the business, which was supposed to be the point of that sort of investment, right? When like public offerings for like stock in companies, it used to be primarily held by the people that worked there and their relatives, right? Because they had an investment in the company, and the longevity of the company meant they had a job, right? Whereas if you're somebody who just invests in businesses, the point is to make short-term gains, to build your personal wealth and your personal portfolio, not to make sure that PlayStation or Nintendo or Xbox or whomever is still here 30 years from now, or that the games that they make now are artistically meaningful and impactful and have the strength to then warrant making enough money to keep the business afloat, right? And like, I think when you have that kind of mentality, you're constantly putting the cart before the horse, because the end game is always, what is the monetization model? Not, is this good? Will people like this? Will it influence people? Like, that's really when you're making art, like when what you sell is art, right? Like, it's like, you know, yeah, like you can phone shit in for a while, right? Like, we're talking about it in Hollywood. We're talking about it in AAA in some levels, right? But it's like that fucking chicken comes home to roost at some point, my man.
And I feel like that was the trajectory that PlayStation's kind of been on this year. It seems like it's been
course correction
over and over again,
right? It's they're trying to pull the plane up now because they were nosediving. So this was the last quote I really wanted to pull out here, because, you know, we talked about the problem with the profitability of streaming services, right? And how investing $500 million in a new game doesn't actually necessarily correlate to more subscribers. It's you're selling more to the same people, right? And Shawn made a really good point about that when he was talking about these emerging markets and how they're going to be important moving forward for like the business side of games. He said, I think that it's so important for the overall global gaming system, because the one thing I've been talking about in my 5 years since I retired. Have you really retired? It's like, bro, you're still out here. Like, you're still working. You're ridiculous, but I respect you, Shawn. It's very simple. We need more people playing games. It's a $250 billion global business, but the actual number of players doesn't grow at the same pace. So we're getting more money from the same people. You need to get more people playing games. How do you do that? We need to get more people making games. More people around the world have to be in the business or the art of making games. Make it for your neighbors, make it for your friends, make it for yourself, but don't think that the Western market is the be-all, end-all of your activity. Build it here, be successful. I think that is right on the head, man, right? It's like, this is the entire fucking problem we found ourselves in now 4 years removed from 2020. While we're seeing all these layoffs, studio closures, all this shit is because like this is the problem, is that like video games had a real boom period and it's truncating, and people have less money and less time, and there are people that were in their 30s 10 years ago that are in their 40s now, and they have less time to play games, and us who are in our 20s or now in our 30s, we have less time to play games. Like, you need to be growing that market, and like that is only going to come from making new, interesting, dynamic shit and not chasing trends from games that came out 10 fucking years ago nearly now, right? Like, Fortnite is going to be 10 years old in 2 years. And we still have these companies chasing a model that is now a decade old. That's dumb. Like, that's bad business. And it's like, I know, grain of salt, armchair quarterback, all that. I am so confident in saying that that is not the solution. That is not how you invest in the future and the health of the industry or your company or whatever, right? Is by just farting out budget God of War or copying Fortnite or whatever, right? Like, it comes from innovation and creativity, and at the end of the day, games that are fun to play. That's what makes money. Fortnite makes money because it's fun, not because it has a season pass.
Yeah, 100%. But the season pass is a great way to monetize it. It got people through the door. It got people to try the game for free and then allowed them to get revenue.
Right, but they made the game fun
coming back
before they made $1 billion a month, right?
Very true. Yeah, they did.
I think it's that simple. You know, like I think Shawn's right? It's like the focus needs to be on making stuff that's quality, not what is the business model for this, right? It's like, look, dude, the business model is selling fun video games. That's how video games make money. And yeah, microtransactions and season passes and all that stuff, they can be great. They can be a great way to monetize a game. They can be a great way to make more money on a game. That's fantastic. But if that's where the idea originates, is we need a games as a service, let's work backwards from there, you're starting at the wrong place. You just are, right? Like, you know, Concerned Ape didn't make hundreds of millions of dollars on Stardew Valley by trying to copy something that was already popular, right? It was like, how do I fill a niche that has disappeared? How do I give people that there's clearly a demand for this kind of game? He brought up the Tom Hanks in Vermont, right? Like, there's a demand for that kind of thing, right? Like, just because it's not going to make $1 billion at the box office doesn't mean that there's no money to be made in making that kind of thing, right? And it's like, I genuinely think that, like, there needs to be a major attitude shift among C-level executives in this industry, because otherwise the bubble's going to burst, and it's going to be a bubble burst the way that it was in the past, and not, hey, we're settling into a new normal, right? And that's what we need to be able to do, right? It's like, if video games are going to have the longevity of these other art forms and not fall into the same, you know, pitfalls that Hollywood and the music industry and the book industry and every other, like, all these other things, right? It's like, that's it. It's got to be quality. It's got to be about making things that connect with people, and not how do we make the most money this quarter.
Strive for the FlipScreen seal of approval, and you will succeed in life, I think, is all people need to take away from this conversation.
I think you're right. Yeah, clearly. We're the tastemakers. So go make some tastes.
100%.
Folks, I'm interested in hearing what you think about this episode. What is your feeling about what Shawn Layden said? Do you relate to what he said? Do you think that he is like us? Maybe we're like old man yelling at the clouds, right? Like, it's like, and things are just changing, and things are going to keep changing? Or do you think he has a point that maybe there is something to be learned from, you know, kind of the history of how we made games at a time where there was a little bit more room for creative risk, when there was a little bit more room for innovation, rather than everything needing to be a surefire bet, right? Because I think that's why we just came out of a golden age of this in this industry, is that we had an unprecedented level of interest and money that led to a lot of blank checks for people to make weird shit.
Yeah. Uh, I think it's interesting to see where things go. I'm interested to see what Sean's got up his sleeve because I think there's something.
I hope you're right.
Interested to see what Tencent's got going on. I hope it's something like, these 15 to 20 hour
Like a
experiences and
private
games.
division imprint of
Yeah.
Tencent that's like,
Yeah, it'd
hey,
be great to see.
here's this hot new game from Indonesia or Korea or these
Yeah.
other like less represented markets. I would love to see that, frankly. I think that's like something one of my favorite things about video games is how they're such a powerful tool for allowing you to have a taste of somebody else's experience. And yeah, getting more games from different cultures and different points of view is only a good thing. So yeah, hopefully that's the case. So like I said, write in flipscreen.games. I want to hear what you thought about this. Do you think we're a bunch of old men yelling at the clouds? Do you think Sean's onto something? And do you want more of those 15-hour AAA-esque, AA-esque experiences? Because I think it's clear that we both do. I'm interested to hear from you guys and what you're thinking. So all those ways that I said, you can go, you can get involved, you can join the Discord, you can write in, you can check out our sister shows, Nintendo Noise and the Steam Deck podcast, however you choose to get involved or show your support. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a member of the community, and we love you. For the crew, I've been Pete. He's been Steve. We'll see you next week.